In February of 1996, a pregnant woman is attacked in her Bronx apartment with her young son as a witness to the brutal crime. The case seems like it's going to be solved early on when a witness comes forward and names who they say did this. But as quickly as this comes together, it falls apart and the case goes cold for over 2 decades. That was until a series of events lands the case in the hands of Bronx homicide detective Robert Klein, who starts reworking the case from the beginning. The investigation into Jasmine's murder perfectly illustrates how nothing is as seen on TV. Detective Klein's thoughts on who did it weaved in and out of different people in Jasmine's social circle as he re-interviewed key people. That was until a DNA hit revealed a name that was nowhere in the police file and uncovered a monster who had terrorized the women of Davidson Avenue for years. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I typically cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time meant a safer time. However, this week, I'm bringing the solved case of Jasmine Porter. This week's episode is a little different for a couple of reasons. If you recognize the name, it's because I covered Jasmine Porter's case back in 2024. It was part of a 2-case episode of Solved Cases to highlight how, even with the passage of time, there is hope for resolution in these older cold cases. But at that time, I only knew part of the story. Earlier this year, I received a message from retired NYPD first-grade detective Robert Klein, introducing himself as the lead detective on Jasmine's case, and complimenting me on the quality and accuracy of the episode, which of course I so appreciated. If you're a regular listener, you know that from that conversation, we have connected for a couple of episodes, both on his career in the NYPD and on the unsolved 1998 homicide of Solomon Robinson. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, definitely check them out. But after talking to him this first time, I knew right away I wanted to revisit Jasmine's case with him and have the opportunity to share the complete story with his perspective woven in.
Yeah, and I just want to say I'm super excited to take you through this because it is, I think people think that like these cases get solved by this like lightning bolt moment. It's not. It's like a process. There's frustration, there's contradictory information, there's theories. The twists and turns could easily become distractions, right? And there was setbacks in this case where like my theory was it was this guy, and then it slowly moved off of that. And I think one of the biggest pitfalls to these cases, obviously, is tunnel vision, right? I mean, once you become emotionally invested in a case, which of course it's almost impossible not to, it's not always the best thing to do, especially for longevity, but it happens. And I was emotionally invested in this case. And I think, the human temptation is always to sort of force the facts to fit your narrative, which is day one in homicide training is you never let your theories dictate your evidence, right? And I think what kept this case moving and for me to stay disciplined was to be open-minded and just follow the facts wherever they come, even if they were inconvenient. That was a lot of different suspects that sort of came across the desk until we were able to sort of drill down and figure it out.
Jasmine was a beautiful person, a mother, a sister, a daughter, and someone who deserved to live the long life of memories ahead for her and her growing family. The path to justice in this case would be long. Her family would have to have immense perseverance for the process. But in the end, the person who took her life could not hide forever. I want to thank Detective Klein for joining me once again for this episode, and for New York Times reporter Chelsea Marcius, who reported on this case in depth for months and months. I've linked her original reporting in the show notes, and I do use some of her articles to piece things together as well. Just a content warning up front, parts of this episode do discuss sexual violence and strangulation. It's one of those cases where some of the more specific details of those attacks are important to share to be able to see the overlap and patterns in various cases. Lastly, some names in this case were changed for anonymity purposes. And with that, let's get into it. It was Monday, February 5th, 1996, and with the start of that new day brought concern to a couple of friends and neighbors of 36-year-old Jasmine Porter. Nobody had heard from her since late Saturday night, and this was unusual, so they went to check on her. One such person was her friend Joyce, who had the nickname Deucey, and you'll hear about her throughout this episode. She had spent some time with Jasmine on that Saturday evening. She knew Jasmine, if she was home, her 4-year-old son Jeremy would be there with her. So when they knocked at the door and heard him, but not her, the concern only grew. Here's Detective Klein.
My understanding is that they had a conversation with Jeremy, her son, who was 4, turning 5, through the door, and eventually were able to motivate him to open the door and went in and found her deceased. And I remember in speaking to her, I spoke to her a few times. She did say that, Jeremy was afraid to open the door as they were trying to coax him. And I think it was just like, at that point, it was like a wellness check. Like, where's Jasmine? No one's seen or heard from her, yet we have Jeremy communicating through the door.
When they made entry, they found a horrifying scene. There was their friend and neighbor Jasmine, clearly deceased on her bed. Joyce and the other neighbor quickly dialed 911 for help.
I live 1706 Davidson Avenue. I need the police emergency to apartment 2I, a woman that I know named Jasmine Ziona Porter. She's pregnant, but her son told me she never woke up. She's done hemorrhage through her nose, and I think she's dead. She's all blue and black. Okay, ma'am. And he's only 4 years old. Right. Okay, stay on the line because we did get a call on it. All right. I'll be right there when y'all line with me, okay? So yeah.
Jasmine was on the bed, baby bump exposed with dark bruising around her neck, a visible indicator that she had been strangled.
They made entry. They saw her body there. Obviously, the police responded. They were able to see that Jeremy had used paper towels to sort of blot the blood off his mother's face, which is like just devastating imagery. Even in my hard drive of terrible things I've seen, that is my brain. Like, just this 4-year-old boy blotting the blood off his mother's face is just incomprehensible.
In addition to that, Jeremy knew that his mom was injured and that people who were hurt needed ice. So the preschooler dragged a kitchen chair to be able to reach the freezer and then came back and placed the ice on his mother's forehead. I agree with Detective Klein. The visual is just beyond words.
The cops that responded noted that there was zero forced entry. The windows and doors were intact. We know that the apartment was not in disarray, so there wasn't like an extended struggle. This wasn't a burglary or robbery gone wrong. And it's safe to conclude, although not absolute, that she provided entry. And even in the early statement of young Jeremy, he articulates that his mother was having an argument with a man in her kitchen, and at some point they were in the bedroom, and that he sees the man sitting on top of his mother, and his mother called for him to help, and that he tried to help her, but she was too heavy. That's literally in the detective's interview of Jeremy back then. Again, incomprehensible that, this little boy was A, experienced that, and B, recalled it to the investigators at the time.
Detective Klein mentioned that the apartment was not in disarray, and he provided me a couple of photos that I'll have on the Instagram page at Simpler Time Crime Pod. You'll see her house looks picked up, pretty tidy for a tired mom in her second trimester of pregnancy. It looks lived in and ordinary. Jeremy's bedroom has Barney stuffed animals and decor, his sit and spin, his skateboard, and his toy trucks. Her kitchen table looks just like mine. What's supposed to be the table ends up being the catch-all for purses, mail, other items. But it's cared for and looked after. If anything, outside of all of Jeremy's things, the apartment looks a bit bare, which could be her living within her means, or could reflect that she was getting ready to move soon. Detective Klein told me that where Jasmine lived at 1706 Davidson Avenue was a tough neighborhood back then and still is today. Jasmine's brother Derek had described the neighborhood, in particular her block, as unsettling to him, and he didn't like his sister and nephew living there. Like any protective brother would, he helped her secure a new place on Long Island where they had grown up and where he still lived. She was just days away from this move that would bring her closer to her family as she prepared to welcome her second baby and raise the children on her own. But Jasmine and her children were robbed of that fresh start together. I did ask Detective Klein if he could walk me through a little more of the process of what it would have been like for Jeremy to be interviewed at his age back then. And even though he wasn't working the case back then, he does know about Jeremy's interview and the process for interviewing young witnesses.
Sure. So Jeremy testified in a grand jury for this case, and he did so, at 5 years old. And there is no magic age to be swearable in New York State. It's basically a judge does basically like a voir dire of the juvenile witness, where it's almost like a forensic interview, where it's determined to what their cognition level, their intellect. Do they understand the difference between good, bad, truth, lie, and their ability to recall? And if a judge, develops an opinion that they're swearable, then they can be used. And that definitely was the case for Jeremy.
Detectives investigating the case in those early days had to put together a timeline, and they began talking to Joyce, or Ducey. She begins telling investigators about a party she attended with others on the night of Saturday the 3rd, and she says that present with her was a man named Charles, whose nickname is Charlie Rock, a man named Keith, whose nickname was Poochie, and a man named Henry, who everyone called Butch.
So they interviewed Ducey really early on. Ducey says there was a party there. They were, having a good time. Jeremy was present, obviously. And that as the party sort of wound down, it was only her, Butch, and Jeremy left in the apartment. And at some point, she was getting tired. She was ready to leave. And Butch asked her to go get him a bottle of Henny. She declined and said, "No, I'm done. I'm calling it." And they left together, but her understanding was that Butch was going back. So that's the last time she sees Jasmine. That might have been a little before, a little after midnight, 3rd going into the 4th. And of course, fast forward to when she discovers Jasmine. She obviously tells investigators who was there, right? So you had a list of people to interview. Those are the last people that were present. Obviously, Butch, right, is going to get some additional scrutiny because presumably he went back to the apartment when Ducey left.
And investigators would only get more suspicious of Butch when they get information from another potential witness.
The case takes an abrupt turn really early on. A gentleman who becomes quite an antagonist in this case, by the name of Jose Layson. Jose Layson gets arrested for a burglary literally the day after in a building I think the building on the opposite block directly in front of or behind him. And they get him in the act, and he immediately says, "By the way, I know who killed Jasmine." So, sure, let's sit down with the DA. We'll do a stenoed statement, and we'll memorialize it. And then I'm sure you're looking to make a deal, right? Of course. So what Layson says is that he'd last seen Jasmine, Poochie, Butch, and Ducey on Sunday at about 4 p.m. Now, we already know that is not good info, but that in the early morning of the 5th, he was coming down the stairs, 1706, and hears screaming coming from Jasmine's apartment, which causes him pause, obviously. He sticks around on the stairs one level up and watches, and then sees who he knows to be Butch sort of hastily leaving the apartment. And one thing that he says, which creates sort of a dark element to this for a couple reasons. He says that Butch was wearing a Colorado Rockies hat. Now, Jeremy, when he's interviewed by the police, even in his 4-year-old adolescent mind, said the bad guy was wearing a Colorado Rockies hat. And we're talking about like the day 1 through day 5 of this, but like as I'm reading this, reinvestigating this, I'm like, oh, Jose Layson literally knows something, because him and Jeremy didn't collude to come up with the Colorado Rockies hat narrative. Jose Layson enters an agreement that he's, going to testify for consideration on his Bird case. I guess they liked Butch to the extent that he was there and that, Jose Layson's statement seems legit. He's describing the same clothing. He was present. And even in some of the narratives from Ducey, Butch was involved in the drug trade, but Butch was a little aggressive with women. Like, they were painting a picture and it kind of looked good. I don't blame them for making this arrest, but they did in May of 96.
To complicate things, though, during this same time, the finger was being pointed at a different person as well.
Another interesting thing that I found, and I don't even know how it was digested back then, is subsequent to the arrest, on May 20th, 96, a guy by the name of Gary Delaney passed away in 99 of a drug overdose. He is interviewed after he's arrested for drugs, and he says Poochie, not Butch, Poochie was in Jasmine's apartment on the day that she was murdered, and that he was really angry with Jasmine about maybe some misplaced narcotics, and that at 5 a.m. on that date, he was called to the apartment, and that something to the effect of, I put her to sleep. I don't know how this affected the decisions back then or how, it was definitely part of the case because it was in the file. But again, now you have another eyewitness, so to speak, who's identifying yet someone else.
And the case against Butch would continue to unravel.
It goes to trial. Layson is called from prison to testify. My understanding is he initially refuses. He's compelled to court where he recants. He said that when he did the lineup identification, when he initially did the lineup identification, he picked the wrong guy and then he steps out of the room. He's like, I know who the right guy is. I picked the wrong guy. Let me tell you who it really is. So, this is like a disaster from the beginning, but he gets to court now and he says, the guy I ID'd was not the guy. I have no interest in doing this. And obviously that case falls apart like in real time. And the case from that point on, essentially goes cold. I'm sure that, there might have been someone along the lines between the DA's office and the detective bureau that thought Butch was the guy based on the facts, right? Maybe they just lost their witness because he was intimidated or whatever. Obviously, we know that's not the case with the long game.
Yes, the long game is what it would take. And speaking of that, don't forget about Jose Layson, because it's not the last you'll hear of him.
He initiated and derailed the case against Butch, right? But then it's Jose Layson who reignites the case. Ultimately, maybe that's some like aligning of, the cosmic fate or whatever.
Once the case against Butch fell apart, Jasmine's case became ice cold. But she was never far from the minds of her loved ones. When Jasmine's brother Derek and her sister Shauna were interviewed for the New York Times piece, they spoke of a sister who was silly and full of life. Shauna had actually found out the news about her sister via phone call from her mother as she was writing out her sister and nephew's birthday card. Jasmine and Jeremy shared the same birthday, and 11 days after the murder, Jeremy turned 5 and Jasmine was supposed to turn 37. Shauna remembered her sister as beautiful. Jasmine would braid Shauna's hair for her, and they'd borrow each other's clothes. And Shauna would get Jasmine laughing so hard she couldn't breathe. Both siblings spoke of her beautiful singing voice. Derek's grief was so heavy that he couldn't bear to hang a photo of Jasmine on the wall, and he would cry any time he drove past the cemetery she was buried in. As the investigation stalled out, Derek tried going to Davidson Avenue himself, relentlessly trying to speak to anybody who may have answers about his sister, but he ran into dead ends too. According to the New York Times piece, during his childhood, Jeremy was raised in Sullivan County, New York, about 2 hours north of New York City. He was raised by his grandmother, who was fiercely protective of him. But he worked hard despite all the trauma he had endured. He did a work-study program through high school, he learned a great trade, he got into that work, and he relocated to another part of New York. He carried just one photo of him and his mother through life, and 2 memories. One of him eating popcorn and candy with her for his birthday, and another was that traumatic night. Year after year, Jasmine's large family continued searching for answers in her case. But like so many impacted by homicide, they also had to learn how to keep moving forward while living with the weight of unanswered questions. And then, in late 2019, 23 years after Jasmine's murder, a jail phone call would change the trajectory of the case.
2019, when ADA Scott Romano, now is an ADA out in Long Island, great guy. He prosecuted a person by the name of Jose Layson
I told you not to forget about him.
for a cab robbery case where the cab driver is stabbed in the head, and it's a brutal case that like the blade breaks off in the driver's skull, but he lives, thank God. He is convicted, and Jose is a predicate felony offender now. So as a result of that, you go through a predicate felony offender hearing where the judge basically listens to your entire criminal history and determines whether or not that you have like enhanced sentencing guidelines, which there was. Layson ends up getting 15 years on this cab robbery. During the course of that, he is yapping on jail calls, and to Scott Romano's credit, he is listening it, and he immediately hears him discussing this case. And I'm going to give you some direct quotes here. He says to someone who's a female, a female in his life, says, "I was there when it happened, but I didn't do it. I told my lawyer they're going to bring up this murder charge. I was with a different woman. We were both present when it happened. I took it to grand jury. She took it to grand jury. They dropped the charges on me. They dropped the charges on her and left me with a burglary charge." He also says, "I should have been charged with that murder in 96. I should have never walked out from that. I should have been in jail for 25 to life, and I didn't." So again, is it Butchie? Is it Poochie? Is it Jose Layson? You have really, this case, at its onset could go in any number of directions. He goes on to say that he's been effed up since that moment. I allowed that young lady to get killed. I didn't do nothing to stop it, and it's been eating me and hurting me, and it's been bothering me for years. I allowed this N-word to choke this bitch out, kill her, and I feel really effed up. So if you're listening to this guy has inside knowledge, right? Or he did it, or he was part of a group of people that did it. But Scott Romano listens to this, and fall of 2020. Yeah, that's when I think he was convicted in 19, but this is going into 2020. Fall of 2020, he reaches out to me and he says, "I think this guy knows who did a murder, and I think he's worth talking to. Do you want to look into this?" And I said, at the time, I was part of a gang task force after a police officer was killed, and we were getting close to our big takedown. And I said, "Yes, I will 100% dig into this, but you just let me get back to homicide. January of 2021, I'll be back and I'll dig into it." So to his credit, he kept it. And I literally remember going to his house in Manhattan and sitting and listening to the stuff and being like, I think this guy has something of value. Let's go talk to him.
When Detective Klein got back to the Bronx Homicide Unit, he was ready to dive right in, but he would face some obstacles.
And early 2021, I got back to homicide. I think first step in this case was trying to find the folder, and which can also always be a tall task. A lot of these precincts, they've been underwater 5 times. There's any number of natural disasters which have taken out old files, poorly maintained and cataloged. But I came up empty when I went to the 46th precinct where this occurred the first time. And I actually went down to criminal records and sat on the old microfiche machine like it was 1996 and I was back in high school. And I got some stuff off microfiche, enough to get started. I came back to homicide, and I remember going to my boss, and I wanted to talk to him about it and saying, there's this case, I really want to dig into it. This guy's got intel. He's sitting for 15 years. I'm sure maybe we can work something out. And I'm telling him about the case, and without even responding, he just gets up. This is my old boss, Lieutenant Sean O'Toole. And he just walks over to like a large pull-out file cabinet with like a long drawer. and like shuffles through the cases and then pulls it out and hands it to me. And I'm like, he's like, you should have came to me first, kid. And I mean, that's O'Toole, you know, if there was a really high profile case, or if there was a case that he wanted someone to look at, or he had a collection of them throughout the years. Every once in a while, he'd pull one out and hand it to you and say, go to work.
Just a personal side note here, I loved hearing that Jasmine's case had stayed in Lieutenant Sean O'Toole's Rolodex of cases that had stuck with him. Sometimes a family might feel like if a case isn't actively being worked on, that their loved one was forgotten by law enforcement. And in this instance, in this case, hearing this had to give some confirmation that Jasmine hadn't been forgotten over all these years.
I dug into the case. I opened it. I saw all the different interviews that were done. I saw the lead up to the arrest of Butchie. But the one thing that grabbed me immediately was the forensic bio report. Stated pretty clearly that, well, she was definitely 5 or 6 months pregnant, I believe, and that her fingernails had been retained, not tested. So having worked on a few strangulation cases and talked to plenty of detectives who successfully worked them, any strangulation case, any ligature case, the nails always become super, high value, extremely probative evidence. And, obviously the hope is that your victim is scratching away at whoever's blocking the airway. So I reached out to OCME, which a lot of times they're very busy with new cases. So you kind of got to have a friend over there. And the evidence storage back then, it's like, I've never been there, but my understanding is it's large paper barrels by year. And then there's like a manifest of what evidence is in that barrel. And throughout the years, someone might have taken it out for testing or for investigation, not put it back. I've gone to barrels in other locations, similar, and looked at similar manifests, and it says it's there and it's not there. But you put your hope in the folks that they're going to do the right thing. You kind of assign them you give them the sob story about this case and the details, and you get them emotionally invested. And I feel like I got that with my initial contact there. So that was sort of in the process. But, anytime you open an old case, it's not just like hope and wait for your magical DNA hit to happen. You have to reinvestigate the entire case. You have to basically work it like it is day one. You have to identify all your witnesses, all your sources of information, even your persons of interest, and you have to re-interview them, and you have to account for what they said back then, what they're saying now, and see what you have. My very first step in this, though, was reconnecting with the family. And the Porter family is a large family. They're a close-knit family. And I remember I looked on Facebook. So I sort of figured out who Jeremy was pretty early on. And I saw that Jeremy's girlfriend was connected to someone I went to high school with. So I actually reached out to that person and said, hey, can you put me in touch with Jeremy Porter? She said, no problem. And I think I got a phone call. I think my first phone call was from Derek Porter, Jeremy's uncle, who I've become very close to. And I told him what I wanted to do. I told him I was going to work through it. I said, there's a lot of suspects here to work through, but I'm going to get, I'm going to work it like it's brand new, day one. And I think over those weeks, like I had to do phone calls with like maybe 5 or 6 siblings in the Porter family. Some people were like not happy about, I wouldn't say that we were reinvestigating it, but that it had gone this long. But for the most part, everyone was super grateful. I had an early phone conversation with Jeremy, and I knew just by talking to him on the phone that he's an absolutely great kid. Great kid. And, I think I've said this before. I'm always looking for that healthy stress, that motivation, and someone to be accountable to. And with cold cases, a lot of times, maybe you don't even have family members, maybe, they're elderly. But here I had a group of people who, I was telling them my plans, and I was telling them that I was officially accountable to them. And they, I gave them my cell phone number. They certainly used it because between Derek and Shauna Porter, Jasmine's sister, we spent hours and hours on the phone. and it was talking about the case. And it's not always beneficial to tell your family members everything you're doing in a real time case, right? Because you don't want to you don't want to get back to the neighborhood. You don't want to undermine your efforts. With a cold case, I think it's a little bit different, at least from my perspective. I think you can tell people what you're doing and your progress probably a little bit more. Maybe some would disagree, but I just fell into this sort of dynamic where I was giving them pretty consistent updates, and I told them about Lason's narrative on his jail calls and what I plan to do. And I think he might be a suspect, that there's this other thing with this guy, Poochie. I feel like they appreciated it. And then like it turned into like where we would talk about the case for 20 minutes and then we would talk about everything else for another 45 minutes, and my wife was so patient with it. But I think they needed that. They needed someone to care, and they needed someone to say, this is important, even though it happened 25 years ago.
The first person Detective Klein re-interviews is Jasmine's friend and neighbor, Joyce, otherwise known as Deucey, the one who was at Jasmine's party on Saturday night, and one of the people who found her and called 911 on Monday. And ultimately, he knew he wanted to track down anybody who had been at that party on Saturday, February 3rd, 1996.
She tells us about the party. She tells us that Butch was there. She suspected Butch. But she said that Butch was wearing a very funny hat and that he was wearing a sombrero type hat, which I don't think you can mistake for a Colorado Rockies baseball hat, right? To me, that stands out because you had the two other witnesses, Jeremy and old Layson, who said it was a Colorado Rockies hat. She described how she spoke to Jeremy through the door. She described how when she left, that Butch was basically asked her to go buy a bottle, and she said no, and that they left at the same time. So her statement between 96 and 2021 was consistent. Her memory was pretty good. She also said, we should definitely speak to Charlie Rock, that, he knew he was closer to Butch than anyone else, and that we should find him and speak to him. And in pretty short order, we did. We were able to find Charlie Rock, who died shortly thereafter from COVID. He also expressed suspicion in the fact that he felt Butch was guilty, that, Butch was rough with women, that Butch was there that night. Everyone knew Butch. He said he made an anonymous call to the police stating that it was Butch, and that he thought Butch suspected him of it because he had said something which led him to believe that he was a rat, which in my mind, I'm hearing that and I'm like, wait a second, Butch was worried about him being a rat. Maybe Butch really did it. Again, I'm vacillating back and forth between all these people. And, it's like this case is wide open at this point. Like I am leaning towards Layson or Poochie, with Butch as a strong third. But Poochie died in 2016 of a heart attack, and Layson is currently sitting in jail, right? So the next step, I think, during that time frame was to approach Layson in jail.
So keep in mind that Jose Layson is who tipped off the fresh look at this case, but he is unaware of that at this point. That is until Detective Klein paid him a visit.
I had a folder with, all the players in it. I wanted him. I wasn't going to tell him anyone that I wasn't going to give him any information. Information was going to flow one way. So we sat in the prison interview room, and the minute I told him what this was about, he started sobbing. To me, the minute you evoke emotion, you stand a good chance of hitting the truth, right? And he says how this has been destroying him, how he's thought about this for so many years, and all he can do is hear her screams. I'm like, okay, who did it? He said, Poochie did it. Not Butch, Poochie. He describes Poochie as like a big-time heroin dealer on the block, which his arrest record definitely reflected that, and that Poochie had killed her, for maybe over some misplaced package. I said, you lied back then. How do we know you're not lying now? I do have the Gary Delaney statement where he articulates that he literally spoke to Poochie outside of Jasmine's door, and he said he put her to sleep, right? It was like pretty strong words, the day she's dead. So I want to believe him. And I said, why would I believe you now? And he said, this is something that I've been meaning to say for a long time. And he was believable in that moment. And I said to Lason, I said, all right, well, what do you want? He said, I want to move closer to the city. I said, all right, well, I'm going to bring a lie detector into the prison and you got to pass it. He's like, no problem. I don't even know if I could bring a lie detector in, but I wanted to see how that would affect him. But he's like, sure, bring the lie detector. Yeah. So March 2021 is when we did the initial interview. We led off with the photo of Jeremy, and that's what actually got him to break down as I'm looking at it here. He identifies the same people that were present at the party, and he obviously admits to, I'm sorry, he agrees to taking part in a polygraph. So I start making phone calls after I left there. I'm like, how do I get a polygraph in a state prison? It wasn't that hard. I reached out to state police, and they got a guy who's a polygraph examiner, and we brought it in, and he sat for the poly, and myself and my partner sat a distance away, and he went through it, and we let them do their thing. And the state police investigator walks back over, and I'm like, his face led me to believe he's gonna be like, he's good. And he walked over. He's like, he's full of shit. It's deception. He's lying. And I'm like, oh wow, another curveball. But when you after subsequent to a polygraph, if you fail it, they do like a second interview, like a debriefing interview, where they basically address with you where you were deceptive and see what you say. A lot of times people are like, all right, you got me. This is what really happened. The other thing that the investigator said is he was employing countermeasures the entire time. He was like, I don't know, he was clenching his butt cheeks, I think was the thing, and maybe tensing up his body. I don't know, maybe he jumped on the prison library and Googled how do you beat the poly.
I did interrupt him at this point to ask like 10 follow-up questions about countermeasures and polygraphs and if people can really clench their butt cheeks to try to beat the exam, but I will spare you guys from my line of questioning and we'll just keep going.
He addressed the countermeasures, and Layson admitted he was clenching those cheeks. and he confronted him with the fact that he was deceptive on the questions he had asked directly about the murder, and he didn't deny it. He just said, you know what? He's like, I don't think this is safe for me to do. I think I'm done with this. So that was that. For the second time, Jose Layson was lying on the case, but keep in mind, Jose Layson knows something because he was able to describe the perpetrator's baseball hat. But it sort of ends there, and that was mid 2021 when that happened. And I remember leaving there and being like, God, I bet it's him. I bet it's Layson. Layson has insight. Layson's lied twice. Layson was in that building all the time. He was a lookout for the drug dealers, which was consistent from multiple witnesses. I bet it was him. That's why he's lying. His motive is to throw everyone off, and he's the real perp. So things kind of stalled there, unfortunately.
Detective Klein would continue to work the case, looking for that one key detail that would prove to him it was one of these suspects over the other, while also waiting patiently for the DNA results from the fingernail clippings. And when that day came, one afternoon in 2021, it would change everything he knew about the case.
And then in November of 2021, I was sitting in a federal proffer down in the Southern District of New York, where some guy's giving up the world, trying to avoid getting 30 years. And I remember I got a message. I don't remember if it was an email or a text, but it was someone in the know saying, hey, your DNA came back. And I don't know if this is helpful, but here is your name. And I got the name Gregory Fleetwood. And of course, that was completely off my radar. None of the people I've ever discussed talked about Gregory Fleetwood. And this proffer still going on. The federal prosecutors are talking. I think I was there with an FBI agent. And I just became immersed in my job phone at that point because, our job phones have everything we could do at our computers, we could do at our phones. We have a domain awareness system where every single document that ever existed can be correlated to one person and so on and so forth. So I ran the name, and I scrolled down to his arrest history, and I see first thing I saw was 84 forcible compulsion rape, sealed. Okay. I scrolled down the next one, 1987 homicide, strangulation, not sealed, which means he took the charge. There was something else there. Maybe it was for like a forcible touching on the street or something, and maybe, but I'm like, you know, kind of, it's like one of those, it seems cliche to say my blood went cold. But I definitely, my entire world became focused on my phone and I could hear nothing around me. And then I scrolled down even further and I saw his parole history. And I saw that he was paroled to 1735 Davidson Avenue, which is literally across the street from 1706 Davidson Avenue, literally diagonally across the street. You could throw a baseball and hit both buildings. So in that moment, I knew this was the guy. I knew it. I knew it wasn't that easy. I knew I had to work it up. But I knew in that moment I wanted to get out of that meeting so badly and get back to my desk and start digging in and finding all these cases.
Now, once again, Detective Klein can see his record and see what cases he needs to seek out. But just like Jasmine's file, they weren't just immediately at his fingertips. And at the same time he was doing all of that, he also learned more about the DNA hit.
It wasn't a direct offender hit. It was a known offender hit, which means it went back to a specific item of evidence that had been tested, and that item of evidence had been correlated to a known offender. And that item was a rape kit from March of 1996, which is 1 month after Jasmine's murdered. And that kit had hit to him maybe in early 2000s, I think, if I remember correctly. But there was nothing in his arrest history about that. So obviously it was obvious to me it didn't go anywhere. From there, I knew I had a lot of work to do. My first stop was to find all the old cases. And for the 84 rape that was sealed, I had to go back to the microfiche. I found it.
The victim in the 1984 sexual assault, we're referring to her as Denise Wiggins. And if you read the New York Times article after this, we aligned that to lessen any confusion. Detective Klein knew she would be an essential person to speak to as a survivor of a violent sexual assault, who she had named Gregory Fleetwood as her attacker back then. Detective Klein also knew that this would be traumatic for her to rehash, and it did prove to be, but she was willing to tell her story and help with this case. Just as a heads up, these next few parts, as well as the interrogation, do get into the more graphic details of these assaults.
And Miss Wiggin alleges that in 1984, she was walking on the street and she saw someone that she knew to be Gregory Fleetwood, who was walking her home, and suddenly he pulled her into a building and up into an apartment where he raped her repeatedly, choked her unconscious. At one point, woke up, let her leave. She then went home. The police were called, and he was arrested a short time after. I found Wiggins in an apartment down south. She's living down south somewhere, and I remember sitting in her apartment and speaking to her, and it was such a heavy moment for her to recount this tale, because it's not something she hadn't did for a long time. Like the visual for me is like sitting there in her apartment and her pulling a cigarette out, and she's like, I quit smoking, but I'm gonna start again for this, and just like lighting it, taking a long drag, and like telling us this terrible tale of being choked unconscious, waking up to being covered in urine and repeatedly raped. And it was like obvious that like this is something that she had repressed, and it was reliving it then. And it was a really super heavy moment. And we learned that her family basically told her that she was, she shouldn't have put herself in that situation, and that it was sort of I guess her father was a business guy and a church guy, and it was creating drama for the family, and that she should drop the case, which is what she did.
In addition to the family pressure, according to the New York Times piece on this case, Denise Wiggins was also pressured to drop the charges by Gregory Fleetwood's sister, who she knew from just living on this block. So she really had pressure from all angles after suffering something so horrific. Hearing the details of her attack, my heart just breaks for this woman. A few years later, in 1987, Gregory Fleetwood is once again arrested, but this time he called 911 on himself. And like Jasmine Porter, the woman in this case was about 5 or 6 months pregnant.
The next thing I dug into was the 87 homicide, Linda Miller. The 84 rape was August 6th of 84, and the 87 homicide was August 7th of 87. Linda Miller, I believe, based on what's in the paperwork, she was a user of narcotics. According to the report and what Fleetwood's own statement, they had met on the street. They went back to his brother's apartment in the 47th precinct. He alleged that they did drugs and had sex, and then they got into an argument. He remembered hitting her and went to sleep, and he woke up and found her to be deceased. He calls 911 on himself to say, there's a dead woman in my apartment. I don't know how she died. And he admitted to cleaning the apartment after he discovered her dead, because as one does. Right. And he is obviously arrested. The cause of death was strangulation. And he pleads guilty to manslaughter in the second and gets 7 to 21 years. So Fleetwood goes to prison. And on the first eligible date of parole in 1994, he is paroled for strangling a woman. He got like 6 and change. And he returns to his sister's residence, 1735 Davidson, where he lived and continued to terrorize the neighborhood.
The other case Detective Klein still had to look into was the 1996 rape, the one a month after Jasmine's attack. Here is a clip from the Gregory Fleetwood interrogation of Detective Klein reading the police report of the details of that assault.
Of 2350 Preston Avenue states, I was going to my friend's house at 54 West 174, which is right on the corner of Davidson and 174. I was going to my friend's house at 6G. When I reached the stairs going to the roof, I reached the stairs on the last floor. Someone grabbed me and choked me. I was dragged towards the stairway going to the roof landing. I lost consciousness. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying in the stairway with no pants on or no underclothing. I didn't have sex with anyone that I know of. I really don't know what happened.
In this 96 attack, the victim regains consciousness. She reports this but couldn't ID her attacker. At the time, biological evidence was recovered. They did a vaginal and anal swab, and biological evidence was found in her anus. So this evidence was stored, and it was a wait and see. There would not be a hit on that until the early 2000s, which led back to Fleetwood. But detectives brought her back in for an interview after the hit, and then they ran into a snag.
When the DNA hit in the 2000s, they brought her in, and she basically said that, listen, I did a lot of drugs back then. I don't know what happened. I have no recollection. And she subsequently passed away, so I couldn't even find her to talk to her again.
And I just want to say here, I know that because of the struggles this woman was having back in 96 and probably throughout a lot of her life, she did not have the recall to be able to move the case forward in the early 2000s. And I'm sad to hear of her passing because I wish she got the chance to know that even though she was struggling with substance use, her bravery in coming forward back then and subjecting herself to the traumatizing experience of getting a rape kit done, that ultimately helped solve a murder one day. Some of these allegations Gregory has never had to truly face head-on, but what we have here is a pattern of women coming forward in his neighborhood with chilling stories when they encounter him.
Within a 1 block period, was terrorizing women.
And just to really illustrate that point, I'm going to jump ahead for a moment to after Fleetwood's arrest to share a story that Detective Klein told me.
After the fact, right, once we arrested Fleetwood, I got a phone call from Ducey. She saw him on TV, and she said, now that I see who it is, she's like, I remember him. And his sister Gwendolyn told me, my brother's coming home from jail. Keep your daughters away from him because he rapes girls. And that he raped a girl whose brother's nickname was Brother. The victim's brother's nickname was Brother. So I immediately called Wiggins, And I said, yeah, what was your brother's name or nickname? Brother. So Ducey knew that Fleetwood was responsible for the Wiggins rape and had been warned by Fleetwood's own sister when he was getting out after the 87 Homie, be careful because this guy likes to rape girls. He's coming home from jail. And she further remembered him constantly hiding in 1706, our place of occurrence, under the stairwell and trying to look at girls on the stairs. So the signs were there.
Let that all sink in. Every hair on my neck stood up with that. Even though Detective Klein was ready to put the cuffs on Fleetwood like yesterday, he still had to build his case before the green light was there.
Because some of this stuff, at least, like the 84 rape and the 87 murder, could be used in a criminal trial. It's called Molyneux material. And it basically demonstrates that a perpetrator has a proclivity to a certain type of violence or criminality, and it's applicable to the case at hand. Now, that stuff gets litigated pre-trial, and sometimes it could be tough to get that in. I don't doubt we would have gotten a living victim of him, and a rape murder that he was convicted of. I don't think we would have had a problem getting that stuff in. So, I mean, that's sort of what I arrived at the end of 2021. I had to search out every other witness that I could throughout 2022. There's some life stuff happening in 2022 that slowed things down. There was a bunch of trials that were happening, and that took us right to August of 2022, where I got the green light from the Bronx DA's office to make the arrest, lined up with our schedules. My prosecutor was not on trial. I was not on trial. And I sat in front of Gregory Fleetwood's house for about 6 hours. And he emerged from the house, and in a very calm and reserved manner, I just walked up to him and I said, "You Gregory Fleetwood?" He said, "Yes." I said, "All right, well, you got to come with me because there's a case against you." And he said, "Case? What case?" I was like, "We'll talk about that when we get to the precinct." And I took him back to Homicide without incident, and we put him in the box.
Detective Klein was a bit surprised by Gregory Fleetwood's demeanor. Typically, he would not be the one to bring Fleetwood in. That would be the job of the violent felony squad, but Detective Klein knew he wanted to see through every aspect of this process right from the first interaction with Fleetwood. Gregory Fleetwood is a big guy. He's about 6'2", and for reference, Detective Klein is about 6'4", so Fleetwood almost came eye to eye with him. But he wasn't confrontational. He described him as kind of meek and unassuming, a contrast to the violence illustrated in all of these police files. When they got back to the interview room, Detective Klein knew that he had to be strategic in how he approached Fleetwood, and skilled interrogations were something that he was well known for.
I knew in this case that I either needed a full denial or a full, I need him to admit to it. Basically, I needed a confession or a denial, nothing in between. I knew it would be problematic. And he's like, "Oh yeah, I knew her. We used to hook up now and again." That would be super problematic. So I literally, I led the interview with, it's an assault case. Do you know this person? He said, "I've never seen her." And I knew.
Did you have any family that lived in any other areas of the Bronx?
I have family that live on.
Okay. What family do you have and where they live in the Bronx?
On Davidson Avenue.
Davidson Avenue.
Yes.
Okay. So this pertains to a case that occurred on Davidson Avenue in 1996.
What does that have to do with me?
I mean, the golden question. So there was an assault that occurred back in 1996. Assault. I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to tell me if you know this person.
No.
You've never seen that person?
No.
Okay. Did not want to talk much about the 87 case. Said that was a mistake that he had done time for.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 1987, you were arrested for strangling a woman, right?
Well, it was an accident. Actually, I was under the influence and stuff like that. And
which makes sense because you actually called 911 on yourself. Is that correct?
Right, and that because it was an accident.
Right.
I didn't really know what happened, but I served my time for that, and I've been all right, just, you know, like, haven't had any problems.
So, having done this for a long time and dealing with a lot of these cases,
yes,
someone who calls 911 to say what just happened typically is not someone who's going out there viciously strangling people, right? I don't think you're a bad guy.
As you can hear in this part, Detective Klein is hoping to lower Gregory Fleetwood's defensiveness and convey to him, you know, I don't think you're a bad guy. I think you're a guy who makes mistakes when you're under the influence, which is also another set of mental gymnastics he's kind of giving him, because Fleetwood can then convince himself, you know what, I'm not a bad guy. It wasn't me. It was the drugs I was on causing me to act that way.
And it literally was just appeal to reason. And I broke down the March 96 rape, the February 96 murder of Jasmine. And I asked him, really, do you not understand that you basically signed your name to this woman's body? You know, do you think you're the unluckiest person in the world? I said, did your DNA actually accidentally end up in all these places? And
all right, well, I don't know nothing about this. Please,
you've never seen this woman before in your life?
No.
So there's no conceivable reason why you can explain why your skin, your DNA, was on her body when she was found dead.
I have no idea.
So look, I know this is a lot of information being thrown at you.
Yes, it is. Yes,
but I want you to consider something for 1 second. Okay? I understand that things happen sometimes that we don't intend to. All right? I understand that. Everyone understands that. What people will not understand, Gregory, is if you're saying this female never had her hands on me, and my DNA is present under her fingers.
I don't know what to tell you about that. I do not know.
All right, so then answer me this.
Yes, go ahead.
Are you the most unlucky person in the world?
I
want you to consider something.
I don't think so.
In Davidson Avenue, in a one-block area, there are 3 separate people who have either been raped or strangled by you. If we believe, from 84, you're saying she was lying. If we believe her, all right, we have this case where this woman's dead and your DNA is under her fingernails, and then a month later there's a woman who's dragged to a roof landing and your semen is in her butt. Now you're telling me this is all just what? Yes. A grand conspiracy?
I don't know what the hell it is. I have no idea. Like I said, I don't know this person. I don't know what you're talking about.
Her fingernails contain your DNA as if you signed your name to her fingernails. And that's established science. That's not something that happens by mistake.
I do not know how that happens.
But we have to explain it.
I don't know how.
How do we explain it?
I don't know how.
But I'm telling you right now that the MO, which is modus operandi, which is something that we constantly talk about in this type of work, demonstrates that when you were high on narcotics, that you had a proclivity of sexual violence towards women, 100%. Now, I'm not saying that you were always in the right state of mind.
No.
You were not always in the right state of mind when you used. You look clean now. Are you clean now?
Yes, I am, but I'm saying...
In 1996, you were not clean. And in 1996, 2 people on 1 block ended up with your DNA.
That is ridiculous.
It's not ridiculous.
It is. To me, it's ridiculous because, like I showed you, I've never seen this woman. And then you're talking about...
Is there a possibility that you were so high during this time frame?
No.
But you were so high that you didn't know what happened in 1987?
No, absolutely not. I mean, in 87, that was a mistake, yes. It was an accidental thing that happened, and that was that, and that woke me up.
His assessment was that it was a mistake made by the lab or something to that effect. I don't know what his exact verbiage was, but that was our mistake. Things get mixed up, and he had no explanation really.
Considering that in 1987 you were saying, I made a mistake.
Yes.
The woman ended up strangled. I was on drugs. Okay? I paid my debt to society. Okay? Granted. Now, in 1996, 2 additional cases, only one of which I'm concerned with this very similar circumstances as far as the fact pattern, comes across my desk, and a scientist who will testify in court that it is your skin cells under her fingernails, and the fact pattern is almost identical. Do you not understand how, in my mind, it seems, or consider a juror's mind,
yes, I understand. I'm listening now.
How they would say, in 1987, a normal guy that was on drugs made a terrible mistake. In 1996, a woman was strangled. her fingernails contain DNA, which in strangulation cases, we know what do victims do. They scratch at their attackers. They scratch at their hands. They scratch at their face. All those things considered, do you not understand our perspective that in my belief system, as far as our beliefs, you were in the same circumstance?
According to the way you explain that, yes, this looks very bad, but what I'm telling you is that there's a mistake here somewhere. I have nothing to do with it.
So you think the mistake was made in a lab?
I have no idea where
Just consider that thought process for a minute. So out of the millions and millions of people in this country, including the 8 million people in New York City.
Yes.
And then you go to New York State, and there's like 50 million people, right? In this DNA system that's maintained, this woman gets strangled across the street from where your sister lives.
And that's
so
terrible.
Not only are you unlucky enough to have your DNA under her fingernails, but furthermore, you're unlucky to the extent that you lived across the street, because it would be a lot easier if your DNA is on her fingernails, but you were in Germany at the time in the service. But it's not true.
Fleetwood, likely seeing that he couldn't talk his way out of this, eventually requested a lawyer, and thus the interview was ended. But even though it didn't end with him confessing, it was still a success.
But I knew we had him with that statement. I knew we had met the burden of the charge, and as we should, because he did it.
Before we get into the discussion of the trial, I want to talk about one more potential case that was put on Detective Klein's radar after the arrest of Gregory Fleetwood was announced.
In the weeks after the arrest of Fleetwood, there was a ton of media coverage on it, and I was sort of just perusing Facebook comments on one particular article, and I saw a woman commented, I knew that guy. I grew up with him, and I think he killed my friend who was also pregnant. So I'm like, whoa, I immediately work her up. I find her. She lives in Texas, and I reach out to her. And she tells me about her friend, Thelma Martin, who was strangled, 6 months pregnant, strangled in the basement of her building with her own purse, and she was raped. And she told me that her, Fleetwood, and Martin all grew up together. They all lived in the same vicinity and grew up together. Now, while this occurred a little bit away from where I was, maybe 2 miles away from where she said they lived, not far in reality, but in Bronx neighborhoods, 2 miles is a lot. At any rate, obviously, I looked at this as another victim, right? And I ordered the crime scene pictures, very, very creepy. It was in a dirty basement. It immediately became evident that there was a ton of evidence left behind. There was a Vaseline jar. There was a starter pistol, like a fake revolver, a jacket, a pair of glasses, because as it went, whatever was happening at the time was interrupted by the super and his son, but they didn't realize that there was a body attached to it. They see a guy down there. He runs past them. They try to chase him, so he didn't get a chance to collect all his stuff that he left behind. She was already dead at that point, but they didn't even know there was a body there. The body gets discovered the next morning. I immediately wanted to triage this as a possible another victim, and there was a ton of potential biological evidence to include semen that was recovered off the body, obviously her fingernails, the purse strap would have been a great substrate for DNA. And of course, the Vaseline, the gun that the perp brought, right? All this stuff would have been a gold mine for touch DNA. And I put in the requests to find the evidence, and nobody can find it. There's been a few natural disasters throughout the years that have destroyed cold case evidence. Hurricane Sandy wiped out these storage trailers that used to hold evidence. And then a few years back, there was a tremendous warehouse fire, which held its own evidence, but it also held the water damage evidence from Hurricane Sandy, right? Because a lot of that stuff, while it didn't become moldy and unusable, If you really needed it, I understood there was a guy who would get in like a hazmat suit and go try to find it, see if it could be tested. All that stuff burned up. So, but even like stuff that the OCME would have collected, like the biological material from the autopsy, like none of that can be located. And I found family, and I did my best to try to figure it out. But obviously, I never got to talk to him about it. And it it died on the table, so to speak. What are the chances that she gets strangled while being 6 months pregnant, and she just happens to have a friend that she grew up with who also strangled two pregnant women?
I know I have an opinion on the chances of that being a coincidence, and you probably do too. But without the evidence being able to be located, that's all it can be for now. And we can hope and pray that somehow, in some miracle, that evidence turns up someday and wasn't lost to flooding or fire, and rather it was just misplaced, misfiled. We can hope because then someone can be held accountable for that crime too, Fleetwood or otherwise. Otherwise, that case is stuck. So let's shift back to Jasmine's case and the prep for trial.
He sat in for a few years, and we were all prepped and ready to go for trial. Trial was slated for the end of, I think it was beginning of January of this year, and right around that time, defense was asking for a deal, and initially it was 12, and we balked at that idea because we wanted to make sure that he doesn't get the chance to do this again. But I fully support the ultimate decision in this case. I want to be clear about that. This decision went to the family, and most importantly, Jeremy, and what he was willing to sit through. And right before we were ready to start trial, the deal made sense.
These decisions are something not talked about enough in this space. When we talk about what the experience is like for a family member affected by homicide or survivors of violent crime, we discuss the crime itself, the investigation, the waiting, and hopefully the arrest of the perpetrator. But oftentimes we end it there without highlighting that thought that the trial is like a whole new beginning of reliving everything for that family or that survivor. And some people want their day in court, and others find it too painful or traumatizing or have their own personal reasons. And all of those choices are valid and completely individual. Jeremy agreed to the plea deal, but he made sure his voice was still heard by the man who robbed him of his childhood innocence and his beautiful mother.
Jeremy gave a victim impact statement. I tell you, I've sat in a lot of courtrooms. I've never seen a judge cry. I've never seen court officers cry. I've never seen ADA Christine Scatia cry. I've never cried in a courtroom until that day. And my wife was there bawling. The family was bawling. It was one of the most emotional and also powerful things I'd ever seen. To listen to Jeremy talk to Fleetwood directly, and tell him how you didn't stop him from being great and a father. And, Fleetwood didn't even have the balls to turn around and look at him. He just sat there. His attorneys just sat there looking forward. And Derek got up, Shauna got up, some other family members got up. All the statements were powerful, none more so than Jeremy's. But it was like one of those moments I'll never forget.
Detective Klein feels forever connected to Jasmine's family, and he knows that they will stay in touch. This is just a prime example of how the work he did throughout his career was more than just a job to him.
And we went out and celebrated afterwards, and these people, I will be in touch with them for the rest of my life. I talk to Jeremy all the time, and I talked to Shauna about 2 weeks ago. I talked to Derek. We're connected. They joke they're gonna invite me to the Porter family barbecue and get me a t-shirt. I'd probably be there if they invited me.
Closure is a complicated word that doesn't resonate with everyone, but the many people Gregory Fleetwood impacted that day can hopefully have some measure of it. Detective Klein made sure to reach back out to Denise Wiggins, who was very grateful. He tried to contact Butch because he recognized that even though the police hadn't done anything wrong in investigating him, he recognized that Butch had a cloud of suspicion over him all these years, and what a burden that had to be. Unfortunately, Butch never got back to him. To this day, nobody knows for sure just how much Jose Layson knows about Jasmine Porter's case or how he knew it. There was never really a need to circle back to him. But the Colorado Rockies hat stands out, and in the interrogation with Gregory Fleetwood, he did get a little spooked when Jose Layson's name got brought up.
Did you know someone by the name of Jose Layson by chance?
Can't offhand remember. Think about it.
You know, I'm just curious. The name's not familiar? He was from that same building?
I'm not sure. I'm not too good with
Okay. I mean, it doesn't matter.
So why should I know him?
Just out of curiosity, if that name rung a bell to you. He's someone that's in prison right now.
What does that have to do with it?
He's someone who's spoken about this case.
He spoke about this case. In what manner? What do you mean?
I'm not going to get into exactly what he said. I was just curious if he knew.
In fact, he ended the interview and asked for a lawyer within 5 minutes of that, what you just heard. So just take that for whatever it's worth. To the many women of Davidson Avenue who lived in fear of the evil living among them, they can exhale that the monster has been caught. And to the family of Jasmine Porter, my hope for them is that with the answers that they waited for so long, that they can finally remember her for just the beautiful person she was. A life that Gregory Fleetwood took too soon.
Yeah, the people that loved her all said the same thing, that she just had a really light personality and loved to sing. And, I spoke to what I guess would be a niece of hers at the sentencing, and she had, such fond memories of, hanging out with her. And, it's just sad because it's just, it's just untold potential, the baby that passed away, untold potential, just such a sad, sad tale.
I want to thank Detective Rob Klein for sitting down with me for this episode and sharing Jasmine's case in depth. He is retired from the NYPD now, but he is working with a great organization called the Retired Investigators Guild. So if you're looking for organizations to support in this space, they are doing great work. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing on this podcast, the easiest way to support me is to leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Word of mouth helps me grow immensely, so please share the podcast with your friends when you're making recommendations. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com, and I'm beyond happy to work with families and law enforcement to get these cases visibility, so please don't hesitate to reach out. As always, thank you so much for listening, and join me again next Monday.